I trust everyone has been able to join us, and I welcome all of you. As they'd say in Paris, Catherine is si nombreux. It's a very good number, and I'm absolutely delighted to have so many people attending. This is I think it's our third lecture in our series of public lectures that are being held throughout the year. And so I'm very, very happy to be welcoming back Catherine Malabou, who is one of our regular faculty and also lecturers. And it's a great honor, and welcome to you, Catherine. Let me make just a couple announcements. First of all, our next public lecture of this kind will be held on May 3rd. And that is going to be with Aisha Liviana Messina. And her topic is the time of fragility. And that will be something of a reflection on what we have been going through. So that I look forward to that very much, May 3rd, for that event. And let me mention to you that Catherine will be leading off our 2021 session, our proper academic session, in June. Our course starts on June 19th with a seminar entitled Unconscious and Negativity, Freud, Lacan, and Their Critical Legacies. And you can sign up for this now. Go to our website. The homepage of our website will give you the proper avenue for signing up. So again, we're delighted to have her in that lead-off position in the session. I will just mention to you that Catherine will accept questions, and you can register these in the Q&A box available there. Please keep these questions relatively short. Otherwise, it's difficult for the speaker to handle all of the material and to be able to move swiftly, particularly after giving a talk. So we'll be grateful if you can make those questions succinct, and Catherine will do her best to address them. I want to thank the Facultät Médias et Communicatie for their partnership in this lecture series. It's nice to have them there in Belgrade with us. And with that, I think let me just add one thing. I'm not going through a long introduction of Catherine because I want to say, if you're here, you know who she is. But I also I want to invite you to look at our website, where we have a faculty bio page. Catherine is her background, her achievements are well represented there. So although it could be that we need to do updating, she's very prolific. So but in terms of her background, you can consult that page. So with that, let me pass the screen to Catherine Malabou and thank her once again for coming tonight.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, for this introduction. Thank you for inviting me to give this talk, and thank you, Nemanja, as well. So I must say before I start that this is a part of a work in progress. So I ask your patience, because the conclusions are perhaps not yet definitive. So yes, but we can discuss, I hope, at the end. So focusing on Foucault's last seminars, the government of self and others, but most particularly the courage of truth, I intend to challenge what has become a usual, standardized way of reading them. In these seminars, Foucault, insisting upon their incompatibility, would have achieved his move from politics to ethics through what he symptomatizes as what he calls the crisis of Parrhesia. I will come back to that in a moment. That is the growing discrepancy between truth and democracy in ancient Greece, he would have developed his ultimate concept of resistance, understood as a total withdrawal from the political scene. The paradigm of such a withdrawal would be the scenic form of life developed in the Courage of Truth, a form of life that radicalizes the motive of the care of the self. They develop mainly in the hermeneutics of the subject. And if the care of the self can still be seen as a negotiation between ethics and politics, the scenic form of life would be a clear rejection of all idea of community and political agenda. So tonight, I would like to propose a different interpretation. I do think that Foucault never sought shelter into ethics, thus preparing a neoliberal individualistic affirmation of life, but on the contrary announced through his reading of the Cynics, a passage to what he calls the other politics, relying on a dismissal not of all politics precisely, but rather of all idea of government, which is of course dramatically different. My contention is that what Foucault describes as a crisis of Parrhesia in the last seminars is less a crisis of democracy or politics in general than a crisis of government. And the analysis of this crisis will lead in the Courage of Truth to a secret split between two concepts of subjectivity. My talk, and of course, I would like to show that this split between two concepts of subjectivity is the prefiguration for new thinking of anarchism. So my talk is structured as follows. First of all, I will present the evolution of the concept of government in Foucault, and then I will come to the crisis of Parrhesia, and then in the third moment, I'll come to anarchy in the last seminar, in the Courage of Truth. So first moment, as we know, there are three main steps in Foucault's conceptualization of the concept of government. The first one is quite traditional. In the early text, government is defined as, I quote, the supreme instance of executive and administrative decisions in state systems as the institution, in the juridical meaning of the term, devoted to the exercise of political sovereignty. So classical definition of government, the government is parallel to the sovereign. It is the institutional form of power. A first major transformation occurs in the seminar called Society, Territory, Population, which is from 1980 in French, where the neologism governmentality appears and will take the lead, as we know, on the analysis of sovereignty that Foucault will progressively abandon. Governmentality, Foucault says, refers, I quote, to the institutions, procedures, analyses and reflections, calculations and tactics, end of quote, that target population and normalize their behaviors. And this is also the birth where governmentality is contemporaneous for Foucault with biopolitics. So this is, of course, a major transformation. But there is a last one, and this last decisive transformation occurs precisely in the last seminars with the concept of, I quote, government by the truth, gouvernement par la vérité, in which vérité, truth, has to be understood as Parrhesia, that is, as we know, truth-telling, or what Foucault calls free spokenness. Why did Foucault feel the need to, I quote, develop the notion of government of men by the truth? It may seem a bit strange after all these books devoted to governmentality. So I quote Foucault from The Government of the Living. He says, over the last 2 years, I have tried to sketch out a bit this notion of government, which seemed to me to be much more operational than the notion of power in the broad sense of mechanisms and procedures intended to conduct men, to direct their conduct, to conduct their conduct. But now, I would like to try to show you how you cannot direct man without carrying out operations in the domain of truth, and operations that are always in excess of what is useful and necessary to govern in an effective way. The manifestation of truth is required by, or entailed by, or linked to the exercise of government and the exercise of power in a way that always goes beyond the aim of government and the effective means for achieving it. So Pareja, this kind of extra government within government, something that goes, he says, beyond government, strictly speaking, is defined once again as truth-telling, frankness. It is a specific kind of truth, irreducible to scientific truth. It is, he says, I quote, a manifestation of truth in the form of subjectivity that goes beyond the realm of knowledge. If government, understood according to meaning number one, institutional, and meaning number two, governmentality, always implies the act of giving orders and the obedient answer, the concept of government by the truth is profoundly disrupting the logic of commandments and obedience. This because government by the truth is a common concern to those who govern and those who are governed. The government's Pareja presupposes an isomorphism, that is an identity of form, between the self of the rulers and the self of the subjects. Rather than operating as a logic of commandment and obedience, the parasystic government is defined, Foucault says, as a partnership with oneself and others. Pareja amounts, I quote, to constituting oneself as the partner of oneself when one speaks, by binding oneself to the statement of the truth and to the act of stating the truth. End of quote. And of course, this binding with oneself is also a binding with others. Foucault is adamant, Pareja is alien to commandment and obedience. He says on page 336 in The Courage of Truth, where there is obedience, there cannot be Pareja. Because Pareja, he goes on, is a way of freely binding oneself. So we would have the very strange concept of a government by the truth, without the logic of commandment and obedience. It is, Foucault says, the condition of possibility for justice. Justice, as he explains in Hermeneutics of the Subject, cannot walk hand in hand with commandment and obedience. And he says in Hermeneutics, taking care of oneself is to care about justice. So we might ask ourselves why then Foucault is maintaining this concept of government when it is clear that because Pareja breaks with commandments and obedience, it cannot be called, properly speaking, a commandment. This question will become more and more present as Foucault goes on in the last seminars. It is clear that what he is looking for at this stage with the government by the truth is what he calls a common light between the rulers and the ruled that would in fact abolish the difference between them. I quote, that the sovereign may be open to the truth, and that there was a site, a place, a location for truth-telling in the relationship with the sovereign, is recognized by some authors like Plato, truth can constitute a common climate or light between the governors and the governed. This is in the government of self and others. Truth can constitute a common climate or light between the governors and the governed. So that, again, we may ask ourselves, why maintaining this notion of government? We, of course, understand that this common climate, this common light, constitutes the site, the space of democracy, the site of ideal, transcendental democracy, where everything is transparent, when truth is the rule. Second moment of my talk, so the first moment was the evolution of the concept of government. Now, I come to the analysis of Parrhesia in the two last seminars and at the very end of Foucault's work. That is, once again, the government of self and others and the courage of truth. It is clear that in the very last seminars, Foucault develops an analysis that undermines this optimistic one and affirms in the end the impossibility of this common light. And this in all political regimes, in tyranny as paradoxically in democracy. And we, of course, understand that Foucault implicitly refers to the current political state of democracies behind his Greek mask. In the government of self and others, Foucault equates what he calls the crisis of Parrhesia with the crisis of democracy. In fact, this common light, this idea of a common light between the rulers and the ruled, will have had a very short life, because very quickly Foucault says that this common light, well, it has, he says, existed once. I will come to that in a moment. But why is it necessarily entering a state of crisis? Because truth-telling supposes equality among citizens, and of course, as I said, equality between the rulers and the ruled. Equality, nevertheless, in Greece is dual. It has two names, Foucault reminds us, isonomia and isegoria. Foucault says isonomia, roughly, is equality of all before the law. Isegoria is, in the etymological sense of the term, the equality of speech. That is to say, the possibility for any individual, provided of course that he is part of the demos, to have access to speech. Foucault agrees that these two forms of equality are first difficult to distinguish, but they are nonetheless different. He adds that the name politics in Greek does not only refer to politeia, which is the title of Aristotle's treatise, politeia, that is the republic and its constitution. Politics in Greece also refers to dynasteia, that gave the name dynasty, dynasteia. And Foucault says, the Greek word dynasteia designates power, the exercise of power. In what sense? He adds, the problems of the politeia are problems of the constitution. I would say that the problems of dynasteia are problems of the political game, that is to say, problems of the formation, exercise, limitation, and also guarantee given to the ascendancy exercised by some citizen over others. So we understand that dynasteia is what threatens the equality requested by the politeia. On the one hand, there is the political problems of the constitution, and on the other, there is the political game, that is the way in which some citizens necessarily have a kind of superiority over others. What does that mean? we remember the two equalities, isonomia and isegoria. Truth-telling requires a talent. And isegoria, you remember, is equality of speech. The possibility for any individual to have access to speech. Yes, but no one is equally talented to speak. Some are more talented than others when it comes to public speech. And the more talented have an ascendancy, a dynasteia, a superiority over others. The influent man possesses the keys to the political game. I quote Foucault, in the democratic game set up by the politeia, which gives everyone the right to speak, someone comes on the scene to exercise his ascendancy, which is the ascendancy he exercises in speech and in action. End of quote. So if isonomia is algebraic equality, everyone has the same right, isegoria is proportional equality. Everyone has a right to speak, but only according to one's own talent, in proportion to one's own talent. The most talented have the dynasteia over the others. So we then see how isegoria is a form of equality that introduces inequality within the city. Those who possess the parasystic skill at a high level are naturally meant to govern others. So what Foucault discovers is that, in fact, Parrhesia reintroduces the logic of government because those who are more talented are commanding the others. I said there was only one exception, like the common light, the common climate was reached only once in Greece, and this with Pericles. Foucault quotes Thucydides, who praises Pericles, I quote, to have been at the same time the single most influent man, and yet not to have exercised his power through Parrhesia in a tyrannical or monarchical way, but in a truly democratic manner, so that Pericles, all alone as he may be, being the most influential and not just one among a group of the most influential, is the model of this good functioning, of this good adjustment of politeia and Parrhesia. So Pericles is altogether talented, one of the most talented, and at the same time, one of the most democratic person. But this, once again, happened only once in the history of Greece. After the death of Pericles, Foucault goes on, the balance was definitely destroyed. Henceforth, Athens, Foucault goes on, will represent itself as a city in which the game of democracy and the game of Parrhesia, of democracy and of truth-telling, do not manage to combine and suitably adjust to each other in a way which will enable this democracy to survive. This representation, this image of the bad adjustment of democracy and truth-telling, is found in a number of texts. End of quote. Parrhesia, after Pericles, then becomes only flattery, demagogy, and as Foucault says, false truth-telling. That's why Parrhesia appears as both the condition of possibility and of impossibility for democracy. I quote, it introduces something completely different and irreducible to the egalitarian structure of democracy. End of quote. And we arrive at this paradox. There is no democracy without true discourse, but the death of true discourse is inscribed in democracy. And I quote Foucault again, these are, I think, the two great paradoxes at the center of the relations between democracy and true discourse, at the center of the relations between Parrhesia and politeia, a dynasteia indexed to true discourse and a politeia indexed to the exact and equal distribution of power. So in fact, the balance between pareisia and democracy, politeia and dynasteia, is impossible. So I'm reaching here the turning point of my reading and start the third moment, which will be the longest one. Because of course, because of this crisis of democracy and this crisis of pareisia, many readers, as I said to start with, have concluded that Foucault was desperate and that he was starting to dismiss the political at this stage because he thought that the crisis of democracy was inevitable and that no form of resistance could ever stop this, this crisis. And because he showed that even pareisia itself, as I said, was in fact embedded in a logic of commanding and obedience, that is a logic of government. So many readers have thought that Foucault was saying that the only way was to withdraw in oneself, to develop this kind of individual asceticism we've read so much about, with the technologies of the self, with the care of the self, etc., etc. On the contrary, I would like to demonstrate that the crisis of pareisia and the crisis of democracy did not lead Foucault to turn his back on politics at all, but rather, as I said to start with, to radically challenge the concept of government in all senses of the term: government, governmentality, government of the self, government of others, government by truth. Foucault, in the end, came to the conclusion that these different versions of government all remained centered around the duality of commandment and obedience, that is, around what Rancière will call a few years later, I quote, the axiomatic of domination. And pareisia makes no exception. Far from abandoning politics, Foucault, in the end, will, on the contrary, accomplish a highly political gesture, nothing less, through his analysis of cynicism than a move toward anarchism, that is, a suspension of all, a theory of the suspension of all government. He says in The Courage of Truth, and it is, I think the English translation does not really restitute the French. So in English it is, the cynic transposes anew the idea of an other life into the theme of a life whose otherness must lead to the change of the world, and other life for an other world. In French, it is a change that leads from an other life to a life other, an other world to a world other, une autre vie vers la vie autre, un autre monde vers le monde autre. It plays with the place of the adjective. And I do think that this life other and this world other is also a politics other, and that this politic others is anarchistic. The Courage of Truth, as I announced, is the place where this happens. After repeating the crisis of democracy that was already developed in the government of self and others, the seminar, I think this is a very fascinating seminar, it suddenly proceeds down a steep grade and precipitates the text very quickly from Plato to the Cynics, provoking at full speed a series of splits, ruptures that lead to an anarchist ending. Pareisia first, then Plato 2, then the self 3, and consequently subjectivity 4, find themselves split in two, and the concept of government, damaged by those splits, finally explodes. In the first moment, that is the session of February 7th, 1984, Foucault starts elucidating Plato's analysis of the crisis of Parrhesia and democracy in Republic 7 and Laws in particular. First split, Parrhesia is broken in two, in Plato. For Plato, Foucault says, either democracy makes room for Parrhesia, in which case it can only be a freedom which is dangerous for the city, or Parrhesia is a courageous attitude which consists in undertaking to tell the truth, in which case it has no place in democracy. Okay, so this is a first split, but nothing really interesting at the moment. If we just stop there, okay, we know that Plato develops a strong critique of democracy. So either there is Parrhesia in democracy, but it is dangerous for the city, or Parrhesia becomes something that has no place at all in democracy. Okay, but from there, which is quite a traditional reading of Plato, Foucault will introduce, which is much more interesting, a split within Plato's thinking itself, making appear in a schizophrenic way almost two Platos. There are two Platos facing the crisis of Parrhesia, a crisis that is extremely dangerous for the philosopher in two different ways. The first Plato, or Foucault's first Plato, affirms that when the Parrhesia is in a critical state, the philosopher has to do his or her best to become the educator or counselor of the prince in order to try to rescue Parrhesia, to lead the prince back to Parrhesia through education, etc. The second Plato thinks, on the contrary, that there's only one thing to do when Parrhesia is in a critical state, becoming a dissenter, because the incompatibility between truth and the political game in general is definitive. The philosopher then, in the second case, Foucault says, has to bid farewell to the political arena and its procedures. So once again, it is true that this sentence is ambiguous, because one might deduce from it that that Foucault says that the philosopher just has to abandon politics. But this is not at all the case. It is the second Plato is opening another politics, la politique autre. The first Plato is the one of the author of Alcibiades. The second Plato is the author of Laches. And Foucault will proceed to a reading of the two dialogues, and he does not introduce simply a difference or a distinction between them, but a genuine dissociation that, once again, is a genuine dissociation that happens within the Platonic corpus. And this dissociation prepares the split of the concept of the self and a split of the concept of the subject. And it is amazing to see how this happens, once again, in Plato, with Plato, and in Plato. What Plato prepares, according to Foucault, is a decisive divorce between the self understood as soul and the self understood as life, bios. In the hermeneutics of the subject, Foucault asked, it was a bit earlier than the Courage of Truth, he asked, what is this self I must take care of in order to be able to take care of the others I must govern properly? In The Courage of Truth, chapter 9, he affirms that the answer to this question, what is the self that I must take care of in order to be able to take care of the others I must govern properly, he affirms that the answer is not at all the same in Alcibiades and in Laches. Because once again, in Alcibiades, the self is the soul, and in Laches, the self is life, the living self. This apparently thin difference, incomprehensible even, isn't the soul, the very principle of life, is in fact opening a secret breach in Foucault's political thinking. In The Courage of Truth, the idea that the government by the truth renders necessary a suspension of government, of hierarchy, and a substitution of free partnership for the logic of commandment and obedience disappears forever. It disappears because of the double crisis of Parrhesia and democracy. Foucault, in The Courage of Truth, does not believe in the free binding anymore, in the free partnership. Definitely, there is an incompatibility between government and Parrhesia. That's why the discourse is now different. When Parrhesia is possible within the political gain, and such is the case in the Alcibiades, then it has to speak the traditional language of the government. Parrhesia is only possible at the cost of recognizing, accepting its complicity with the government. That's why the first Plato believes in educating the prince in a way that teaches him how to govern himself just as he governs the other by, I quote, establishing a type of hierarchy and a type of power in his soul and in relation to himself, which is of the same order, has the same form, the same structure as the power exercised in his monarchy. So we see clearly that the only way to save Parrhesia and the relationship between Parrhesia and politics is to reintroduce clearly, frankly, the Parrhesia into the logic of government by teaching the prince to govern himself just as he governs the other, and to govern his soul just as he governs his monarchy. But there is the other Plato. And there is also the other Foucault, that is also the other self. And this one cannot be commanded or controlled because it cannot be governed at all. And this other self is life. At this point, Foucault starts reading Lacaze. This dialogue seems to have, he says, a fairly similar starting point to the extent that it raises the issue of training young people, just like in Alcibiades, because Alcibiades is a young man who wants to become a political governor. So at first sight, the two dialogues deal with the political education, but in reality, Foucault goes on, the dialogue, Lacaze, follows a completely different line of development. Why? Foucault goes on, the question of what exactly it is that one must take care of is never raised in the Lacaze. The theme is we must take care of young people, teaching them to take care of themselves. But it is not said what this themselves that they must take care of is exactly. Or rather, it is not said, and yet it is. But precisely, it is not said by designating the soul as the immortal reality to which one must turn one's attention and which must be the first and last objective of the care of self. What we must take care of is not the soul, it is life, bios, that is to say, the way of living. What constitutes the fundamental object of epimeleia, that is discipline, is this modality, this practice of existence. Foucault goes on, when we compare the Lacaze and the Alcibiades, we have the starting point for two great lines of development of philosophical reflection and practice. On the one hand, philosophy as that which, by prompting and encouraging men to take care of themselves, lead them to the metaphysical reality of the soul. And on the other, philosophy as a test of life, a test of existence, and the elaboration of a particular kind of form and modality of life. Of course, I'm sorry it's a bit long, but I think it's very interesting. Of course, there is no incompatibility between these two themes of philosophy as test of life and philosophy as knowledge of the soul. However, although there is no incompatibility, and although in Plato in particular, the two things are profoundly linked, I think nevertheless that we have here the starting points of two aspects, two profiles, as it were, of philosophical activity, of philosophical practice in the West. On the one hand, a philosophy whose dominant theme is knowledge of the soul, and which from this knowledge produces an ontology of the self. And then, on the other, a philosophy as test of life, of bios, which is the ethical material and object of an art of oneself. These two major profiles of Platonic philosophy, of Greek philosophy, of Western philosophy are fairly easily decipherable when we compare the dialogues of the Laches and the Alcibiades with each other. So sorry for this long quote, but we can see that this divorce, which is not really one, Foucault says, but in fact, it will become one, divorce between philosophy as knowledge of the soul, and of course also politics as knowledge of the soul and as test of life, will determine the two main lines, historical lines of development of Western philosophy and politics. And Foucault will show that the second one will be repressed by the first one, that the second one, that is the test of life, will disappear or at least become clandestine almost through Western history. And it is very clear that in this last seminar, he wants to revive it very clearly. Laches is about the education of two young men whose fathers are politicians who have been too busy to take care of them in their young age. Such a situation symbolizes a solitude of individuals that are abandoned by politics, and more exactly, it symbolizes once again the incompatibility between parrhesia as justice and the bad parrhesia as the selfishness of the political game. In such a situation, Foucault says, the young man's self will have to find a way to fashion itself outside the logic of commandment and obedience, outside the political game. The technique of education as a way to govern one's soul as a monarchy, as it operates in Alcibiades, is helpless there. Plato says in Laches, here, education is not a question of competence. It is not a question of technique. It is not a question of teachers or of works. Of what then is it a question? It is a question of the way in which one lives. In Greek, ontinatropon these. It is the question of the way in which one lives. So this is very enigmatic, because how can one substitute the way in which one lives for a technique, a government of the self, etc., etc. And yet, this is how the Laches ends on this idea that the only way for these two young men to survive is to fashion their life, to form or sculpt their life. And Foucault concludes, this theme of bios as object of care seems to me the starting point for a whole philosophical practice and activity, of which cynicism is, of course, the first example. So we started from a quite banal split of parrhesia in Plato, then to a split, we moved to a split in Plato himself, that is between the Laches and the Alcibiades, and now we have this enormous split between soul and life. And then, rather abruptly, Foucault moves without transition from Plato to the Cynics. He will show how the Cynic philosopher is the highest example of the plastic imperative to form one's life. About him, Foucault writes, the Cynic has suffered, endured, and deprived himself so that the truth takes shape in his own life, as it were, in his own existence, his own body. So parrhesia will become the form of life itself, understood as the form, well, the bodily form, the very form of existence understood as empirical existence. But what exactly is this difference between the soul and life? Because for Plato also, the soul determines the very incarnation of truth in the body. So why this split between psyche and bios, between the Platonic Plato and the Scenic Plato, between Alcibiades and Laches, between those two modes of rules, a series of dissociation that in the end destroy the concept of government. Let me go back to Plato a little bit. In Alcibiades, the hierarchical structure of the soul is rooted in the process of auto-affection, defined as reflexivity. Of course, auto-affection is not a term by Plato, but Foucault uses it in order to designate this self-reflection on the soul. Foucault insists upon the fact that the soul for Plato is a mirror. That is, it has the capacity to look at itself, to mirror itself. And this motif of mirroring is developed at length in the hermeneutics of the subject. I quote from the hermeneutics. If we want to know how the soul can know itself, since we know now that the soul must know itself, then we take the example of the eye. Under what conditions and how can the eye see itself? Well, when it sees the image of itself sent back to it by a mirror. However, the mirror is not the only reflecting surface for an eye that wants to look at itself. After all, when someone's eye looks at itself in the eye of someone else, when an eye looks at itself in another eye, absolutely similar to itself, what does it see in the other's eye? It sees itself. So an identical nature is the condition for an individual to know what he is. The identical nature, if you like, the reflecting surface in which the individual can recognize himself and know what he is, end of quote. So looking at one's eye in the eye of the other, such is the mirroring structure of the soul. But Plato insists that the other in which I look at myself is not on a vertical level. It's not an eye that is on the same plane, the same ground as mine, because in fact, the other's eye is the eye of God. Foucault goes on, it is God then that we must look at. For whoever wishes to judge the quality of the soul, he is the best mirror of human things themselves. We can best see and know ourselves in him. So the soul's gaze has a double direction. There is a certain horizontal, of course, direction, but there's also a vertical one. The soul, while reflecting oneself, looks above. Self-reflection in Plato is always vertical because reflection is in itself a gesture of obedience. Reflection, reflexivity is the archy gesture of obedience. To reflect upon oneself is always to look above. By obeying the divine gaze while looking at itself, the soul is then in its turn able to command, that is to look down. It finds itself empowered and then able to command others. I quote Foucault, at this point, the soul will be able to conduct itself properly, and being able to conduct itself properly, it will be able to govern the city. That's why the economy of auto-affection, the economy of the soul and the logic of government as commandment and obedience are inseparable. And that's why when Pareja wants to play the game of politics, it is inseparable from the soul, the logic of government, and the economy of autoaffection. And it would not be difficult to see that all definitions of government in Western philosophy and political theory rely, in one way or another, on this economy of autoaffection, that is, of self-mirroring and self-reflection, that is, once again, this economy of commandment and obedience. The living self, by contrast, does not reflect itself, does not govern itself, properly speaking. Laques is an aporetic dialogue because it doesn't give us any answer. It does not explain what life does, how the living self escapes the logic of the government. And that's why Foucault moves towards cynicism. In a certain way, cynicism is the answer to the aporetic question of the Laques. What is life? How can we substitute life for the soul? This question will be answered once again in cynicism, in a very radical way. The cynic self is made of two halves, like all selves, but these two halves do not reflect each other, because one of them is a dog. First, the cynic life, the kunikos life, is a dog's life. And second, it's a dog life because, as Foucault says, it is indifferent. It is indifferent to whatever may occur. It is not attached to anything. Its content, this self is content with what it has, and it has no needs other than those it can satisfy immediately. And here, I think we have the strongest critique of autoaffection, on which, once again, all political philosophy, and even Deleuze's philosophy, is grounded in. Of course, there is no life without autoaffection. That is the capacity for the self to be in dialogue with itself. Life is the movement of this self-dialogue. Of course, this is true. But what Foucault says here is that it exists a type of autoaffection that is at the same time indifferent to itself. And this type of indifferent autoaffection is the animal self. The animal is, of course, autoaffected, but does not care about it. So in human beings, Foucault says, animality is not a given, it is a duty. And of course, that's why the cynic has to work, and this is the meaning of to form one's life. This is the meaning of the imperative of shaping one's own life. The cynic has to work to reach this state of animality, to reach such a point of indifference. And by indifference, once again, we have to understand a point of non-mirroring of the self. Of this work, of course, Foucault gives a few examples. He says, I quote, "There's a whole series of anecdotes on this. Diogenes observing how mice live, and Diogenes seeing a snail carrying its house on its back and deciding to live in the same way. Further, animality is an exercise. It is a task for oneself and at the same time a scandal for others. The bios philosophicus as straight life is the human being's animality taken up as a challenge, practiced as an exercise, and thrown in the face of others as a scandal." Why is this bios philosophicus breaking with the logic of government? After all, the animal, and the dog in particular, can easily be forced to obey. One usually commands one's dog, gives order to her. So why is the logic of life different from the logic of the soul? Because if an animal, and even a dog, can be forced to obey, if one can always command one's dog, a dog cannot be governed, because a dog does neither command to herself nor obey herself. The indifference of auto-affection to itself implies the absence of internal hierarchy, of a difference between passivity and activity within oneself. There is an absence of self-government in animality. Therefore, a dog cannot be governed, properly speaking. She can only be dominated, that is, forced to make a difference between commanding and obeying, but this difference will always remain exterior to her, alien to her. The dog is not ungovernable either. It is, or she is, I would say, non-governable, and so is the cynic. So I introduced this notion of non-governable, which does not appear in Foucault, but it seems to me to translate what is at stake here. The non-governable is not the ungovernable. The ungovernable is still comprised in the logic of government. It is simply its negative form. The ungovernable can be disobedience, rebellion, insurrections. All these phenomena are occurrences of the ungovernable. But the non-governable is what remains absolutely alien to the logic of government and something that is non-negotiable. The non-governable cannot be governed, it can only be dominated when its indifference becomes a threat. Foucault describes domination as the freezing, the blocking of power relationships. Power relationships suppose a mobility, a circularity between power and resistance. The logic of government is a relation of power, and Foucault shows that all forms of government engender their specific forms of resistance. But the non-governable, on the contrary, paralyzes the circularity between power and resistance, traditionally understood. But it opens a new form of resistance. Foucault says, there are different interpretations of why Diogenes was called the dog. First, because the dog's life is shameless. Second, because it is indifferent. Third, and this is surprising, because it is diacritical. Diacritical in the sense that it helps making the difference between the good and the bad. What does a dog's life have to do with critique, the diacritical, and the distinction between the good and the bad? Doesn't this distinction suppose a capacity to reflect and to determine the good and the bad as two possible governing principles? At this point, Foucault analyzes the ethical imperative of cynicism, which is change the value of the currency. And this imperative, in fact, implies moving from the soul to life. Change the value of the currency does not amount to change the metal of the coin, but the effigy of the coin. It symbolizes the philosophical life. And to lead a philosophical life implies to erase the first effigy on the coin, which was the soul, to replace it by another one, which is the dog's. In that case, the coin ceases to be a mirror. The change of effigy breaks the reflective surface. It represents what remains unreflected in auto-affection and reflexivity themselves, that is life not the other life, but the life other. And then all of a sudden, this truth that we thought had disappeared reappears in all its splendor. There is truth only when reflexivity is impossible. The truth of cynicism is that truth cannot see itself, which does not mean that it is blind, but that it does not recognize itself in a mirror. When Foucault says with the cynics that truth can only bark, he thinks, contrarily to his previous contention, that truth is non-governable. It is something that can only be dominated because it cannot govern itself. It has this animal frankness. When the cynic tells the king that he, the cynic, is the genuine actual king, he does not disobey, but he says that a monarchy that knows itself, reflects itself, can only be its own caricature. Far from being identical with itself, Foucault's Greek subject is split, torn, between the monarchic government of the soul and the anarchist organization of the non-governable life. The non-governable is the cynic form of Parrhesia, and the cynic form of Parrhesia is the antique prefiguration of anarchism, not an ethics once again, or not only an ethics, but also a politics other. In The Courage of Truth, Foucault himself multiplies the references to anarchism. I just quote one before I conclude. He says, the aspect of bearing witness by one's own life of the scandal of the revolutionary life as the scandal of the truth was, roughly speaking, dominant much more in the movements of the mid-19th century. Dostoevsky should, of course, be studied, and with Dostoevsky, Russian nihilism, and after Russian nihilism, European and American anarchism. Anarchism is taking the courage for the truth, which the Greeks and Greek philosophy laid down as one of the fundamental principles of the life of the truth to its extreme consequence. So in the end, the act of transforming oneself up to the point when oneself becomes indifferent to reflexivity, indifferent to the possibility of seeing oneself, means that one becomes alien to the logic of government. I know this is a very, very strange way of putting things, but the problem is that all forms of reflexivity, as I tried to explain, always imply a difference between passivity and activity, and thus a difference between looking above and looking down, between receiving the form and giving the form too, that is, between obeying and commanding. So I would like to now conclude. We know that Foucault has expressed many times its distance from anarchism. In the last seminars, though, a new concept of the self emerged, and I think it is Foucault's own self. When Parrhesia and the political game or scene are incompatible, when truth-telling has become pure demagogy, populism, or post-truth, or fake news, etc., it is too late to try to educate the soul of the corrupted ruler. The philosopher has to change the value of his or her own currency, and the answer to the crisis of democracy is the barking of anarchy. In fact, Foucault, it is true, has expressed his distance from anarchism, but at the same time, this distance has always been ambiguous. We know that in What is Critique in 1968, he defined critique as the art of not being governed. More exactly, not being governed like that, not so much. And he says, I think that in fact, the will not to be governed is always the will not to be governed thusly, like that, by these people at this price. Judith Butler has a comment on this sentence. She says, Foucault does make clear, however, that he is not posing the possibility of radical anarchy, and that the question is not how to become radically ungovernable. I'm not so sure. Once again, I think the question is not the ungovernable, but the non-governable. It is true that Foucault, for example, I quote a passage of an interview from 1973, in which he says, I'm not an anarchist, as I do not endorse this entirely negative conception of power. But he also says, I quote, the position I adopt does not absolutely exclude anarchy. And after all, once again, why would anarchy be so condemnable? He says in the Government of the Livings, he has this very famous sentence, instead of employing the word anarchy or anarchism, which would not be appropriate, I shall make a play on words. Let's again go a little against the trend and engage in word games. So I will say that what I'm proposing is rather a sort of anarchaeology. So he plays with terms moving from anarchy to anarchaeology. So I plan to study this long archive of Foucault's attitude toward anarchy with all its ambiguity. But it seems that in the end, Foucault had the courage of his own truth, the courage to break the ambiguity and let appear as a new effigy the face of his anarchism. Okay, and I'm done. Thank you very much.